Greetings, all you intrepid Herle Burly-ites. Great day on the pod because we've got a premier in the house. And not just a run-of-the-mill, pick any one of them provincial premier, but one whose voice represents a part of the country I've wanted to learn more about myself for a long time. Premier R.J. Simpson of the Northwest Territories is our guest today. Premier Simpson is a lawyer by training. He was first elected in 2015, representing Hay River North to the 18th Legislative Assembly. Acclaimed for a second term in 2019. Mr. Simpson served in cabinet as Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, Minister of Justice, and Government House Leader. Just last December, after winning re-election a third time, he was chosen by his MLA colleagues to serve as the 14th Premier of the Government of Northwest Territories. So today, a primer of sorts on the Northwest Territories. What are its key issues? What are the constraints on it being a territory? What is the relationship with the feds? How relevant is the national debate to the region? And finally, we'll get the Premier's take on most of the major contemporary issues: climate change and the carbon tax, healthcare, affordability and housing, education and reconciliation. So Premier Simpson, thanks for making some time for us on the Herle Burly today. It's great to meet you.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
An honor, no less. I hardly doubt that. You're a premier of a territory, for goodness sake. How can it be an honor to be on this show?
Oh, you know what? I hear from a lot of people that they say, "Oh, you got to listen to this episode," or they'll send me links. So, in certain circles, you're very popular. So, definitely an honor.
Certain circles, I think, is the key point. All right, let's get to it. As was alluded to in the introduction, you're the premier of the Northwest Territories, but you're not a member of a political party. You did not get elected as a leader of a political party who won a majority or won the plurality in the legislature. You got a different system. How does NWT politics work?
Yeah, we are, much different, I guess, than the rest of Canada in terms of our association with political parties. So in the Northwest Territories, we don't have a party system. We have what's called consensus government, and all of the MLAs run as independents. So there's no party affiliation. They might have party affiliation, but it is not part of their campaign. And so once the 19 members are elected, then we all come together, and as a caucus, as a group, we elect from amongst ourselves a speaker, and then the premier, and then cabinet. And we have it can change from term to term, but there are some conventions in terms of how you get onto cabinet. And so there's a geographical distribution that we've been using for, ever since division at least, where there's 2 ministers from Yellowknife, the capital, then there's 2 ministers from essentially north of that area and 2 ministers from south of that area. And so that makes up the 6 members of cabinet, plus the premier can be from wherever the premier is from. And so there's 19 members altogether, so the 7 ministers make up a minority government, we're a perpetual minority government, and so it forces us to work together, and hence the name consensus government. Although not everything is done by consensus by a long shot, but that's what we strive for.
Okay, so it's deliberately not adversarial in the way that partisan politics is. What do you think the pros and cons of that are?
I don't know if I would have gotten into politics if we didn't have a consensus system, because the adversarial nature of party politics is not something I'm a big fan of. That being said, there are benefits to it. So when we come in as a government, we are a bunch of independent members. The 7 members of cabinet are independent. We don't have a platform. What we do is the 19 MLAs get together, and we, at the beginning of an assembly, develop the priorities of that assembly. And so the government then takes those priorities and turns them into a mandate. And we are still in that process. We were elected in November. We're still in the process of developing the mandate. We'll have that done and tabled in the House by May. And so there's a bit of a gap there. The benefit of a party system is you have the policies in place, you have that infrastructure, you probably put together a team with expertise so that you can hit the ground running. And so I'm a little envious of that aspect of the party system, but I think that's the primary difference.
Right. So when you were selected by your colleagues, was it on the basis of a program that you presented to people, or was it on the basis of a process that you intended to follow, or why did they choose you?
Well, I guess you'd probably have to ask them, but I did have, I guess you could call it a platform. I've been an MLA now for 8 years, including 4 years in cabinet as a minister with a number of different portfolios. And just based on what I've seen and what I've heard, I put forward a vision of the Northwest Territories and sort of embrace the direction that I think we have been going, but perhaps it's been unsaid. And if you look at a map of Canada and the area that's covered in land claims, really everything north of 60 is. So that includes the Northwest Territories. So right now we have a couple self-governments, but a large portion of the territory is still under land claim negotiations. But there's no doubt that we're moving towards a time, and I always look 50 years in the future. In 50 years, we're going to have a number of self-governments, and we're going to have all these land claims settled. And the government of the Northwest Territories is actually going to shrink. It's going to have less authority as the Indigenous governments take on more authority. And we need to work towards that point in time. And so I talked a lot about ensuring that when we develop programs and policies, we're doing it in a way that they're going to be programs and policies the Indigenous governments can see themselves, taking over at some point, making them their own, of course, but setting them up for success as opposed to failure. And I talked a lot about collaborating with Indigenous governments. Half the population in the territory is Indigenous. And so just imagine if there were 20 million Indigenous people in Canada, the political dynamics that would be at play. And so I talked a lot about working with the Indigenous governments on things like going to Ottawa together. If something's good for the GNWT, or if something's good for us, one of us is good for all of us up here in the territory. And so really leaning into collaboration, and especially because, the federal government will pay attention to Indigenous governments on certain issues more so than they will the territorial government. And the same is true for the other way around. And so by working together, we get the benefit of both of those. So I think that was really the thrust of my message. And I probably benefited from the fact that we've had a lot of turnover, and there's not a lot of experienced members in the House.
Right. I want to get into issues, but I do have, because I love politics, have one more question about politics. You said you don't really like the adversarial nature of it. You might not have gotten into politics in a party system. But without a party system, politics must be very personal in the NWT. So you've got small districts that have a relatively small number of electors, in which presumably almost everybody is familiar to some extent with one another. And you're choosing a person without a party label. So you really are choosing a person. Must make it very, very personal.
Yeah, I guess in a lot of ways it is. I think about the MPPs in Ontario with 150,000 constituents, and I have less than 2,000. And
nobody knows who any of those people are. They only know that they voted Conservative or they voted for Ford or something like that, right? So it's very different.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they come into my office here. I'm in the middle of town. The door's always open. And so I don't know if other premiers deal with the level of the constituent issues that I deal with as well. So it is very much on the ground. They say all politics is local, and it's local here. And in terms of it being personal, I guess you do have to sort of sell your personality and who you are as a person when you're running for premier. But there's benefits to that as well, in that because it is personal and you are not sort of just painted as you're red or you're blue, and you can attack the party and the person who is part of that party. So that it makes you look at a person as opposed to a representative of a party. And so I find that helps it be a more respectful process in many ways.
Right. So I normally, when I get somebody like you on who's achieved what you have in politics, I normally ask people how they got involved in politics. But I note that your father is also a member of the legislature, so I presume this is a family business.
Well, he actually followed in my footsteps. So I was elected in 2015, and he was elected in 2019.
Wow. All right.
So he was, but he's not an MLA anymore. He was there for the one term.
Okay.
And so, but
so what did get you into politics?
Well, you know what, and I guess it does go back to my dad and my family. My dad was involved in municipal politics. He was on town council, deputy mayor, but really Aboriginal politics, Métis politics, and so he was heavily involved in that. And my mother was very much involved in the Friendship Center here in the community and helping get that established.
Are you Métis?
Yeah, I am. Yes. Yeah, and so both my parents and my mom was a big player in the NWT Literacy Council, and so there's that sort of the NGO world, which isn't necessarily politics, but it's that almost sort of activism side of it. And then my dad in politics, so it was always around me. I always had an interest in it. I was always studying it, and so this sort of I guess it was in the back of my mind because I made the decision to run for MLA basically over the weekend. It was I had my mind made up. I wasn't going to do it. I had an article set up with the Department of Justice. I was supposed to, so I'm not a lawyer. I was supposed to begin articling the same month as the election in 2015. And I called them up and I said, you know what, I'm going to run in this. And if I don't get elected, I'll come crawling back to you and hopefully you still have a spot for me. But in the end, it all worked out. And I've been the Minister of Justice for a couple terms. So
us non-practicing lawyers, we're an important subset of the population.
Yeah.
So, okay. Let's talk about the NWT for a bit. I'll be honest with you, I don't know anything about it. I've been to Yellowknife once. I've been to Ray Edzo once. None of the national polls that I obsess over and scour for what people care about, what issues are concerning people, none of those tell us anything about attitudes in the NWT because those polls don't capture the NWT. So what are the issues up there? What are the things that are pressing on people that they're looking to government to do?
Yeah, and thank you for that. And you're right. The polls don't capture us. We are, statistically, it's hard to capture things up in the territory. And so a lot of things, whether it's indicators of health or all of these different things, I'll go through the list and I'll see the indicators for all the provinces, but we're not on there. And so, Canada doesn't have access to the information that they probably should about the territory. So we have a lot of the same issues that everywhere else has, of course. I mean, housing, big issue up here, healthcare, big issue up here. But really, I think the big backdrop is the Indigenous government side of it, the Indigenous side of things, and how we're moving in that direction. But we are a huge physical area, 1.3 million square kilometers. We have 33 communities. Half of the population lives in Yellowknife, and the other half lives, scattered across this vast land. Many communities, only a couple hundred people. Many communities without an all-season road. One community with no winter road even. We have to transport a lot of our goods by barge up the Mackenzie River to ensure that communities have fuel and food and, that they get their vehicles and so there's that dynamic as well. We have a lot of natural resources up here. Oil and gas, we've been producing for 100 years. Of course, we've had the diamond mines for the last quarter century, gold mines before that. Looking forward to lithium and other mines coming in the future. And so that's sort of the overall issues that we're facing. We have a lot of issues with infrastructure in the territory as well. I look at southern Canada, and the federal government was instrumental in building the railroad east to west and the highway east to west. And you get up this way, and we don't quite have that yet. We're still working on the Mackenzie Valley Highway to connect a lot of our communities. The railroad ends just north of the border, the Alberta border. And so we're facing a lot of those infrastructure deficits as well. But there's a lot of potential here. I always say, I came back from university, a year later, I'm an MLA, a few years later, I'm a minister, then I'm the premier. So I always tell people, this is the land of opportunity. There's a lot going on here and a lot, if someone has puts their mind to it, they can achieve a lot here.
Okay. One size fits all, proclaims the sales tag. But does it really? One size fit all? Let's interrogate that, Herle Burly-ites. In fashion, it generally just means big, doesn't it? Sloppy big, elastic waistband big, not tailored to individual needs or conditions big. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, says the very same problem can apply to telecom. Hold that thought while I backtrack a bit. Last week, I told you the CRTC is exploring options for mandating wholesale wireline fiber to the premises. How to do it in a way that best promotes competition and provides Canadians with choice and affordability for high-speed internet. At the hearings last month, TELUS reiterated the Commission's own previous decisions, which have said over and over, there is no single national market for internet service. Any one-size-fits-all approach to mandating access to fiber networks won't account for regional competition needs, the effect of current regulation on different regions in Canada, and the investment challenges in building the networks across different parts of the country. Conditions out west do not mirror conditions in the east. Mountains get in the way, vast tracts of uninhabited craggy terrain. The builds are just a hell of a lot more expensive. That's not all. When it comes to existing regional wholesale competition, reseller market share is increasing markedly in Alberta and British Columbia, while significantly decreasing in Ontario and Quebec. That stretches the elastic waistband metaphor even further, Herle Burly-ites. It is simply not one size fits all for every part of Canada. TELUS believes any new mandate must be tailored to different regional conditions. I'll leave it there for now. Next week, more data, and blessedly, a new metaphor. You don't have the powers of a province. Why not? And what would change if you did?
Well, the last time that Ottawa devolved powers to us, it was over lands, and that was in 2015. And so with that, we really do have a lot of, the majority of the powers that the provinces do. One of the things we don't have is the ability to, I guess, borrow money without the federal government's, backstopping us. And so we have a federally imposed debt limit.
You can't issue bonds.
Well, so the debt limit isn't a bad thing necessarily. It stops us from racking up billions of dollars in debt, but it does cause issues when we are trying to deal with issues like wildfires and floods that we've been facing the past couple of years, where we have unexpected expenditures of hundreds of millions of dollars. Our whole budget is $2.2 billion, and so when you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars of unexpected expenditures, it's tough. And so that's really been one of our biggest issues. It's the financial aspect of not necessarily not being a province, but not having that southern tax base to generate revenues to get the things done that we need to get done. And there's some other issues with the management of land and resources, but for the most part, we do have very similar authorities to a province.
Okay, but you do have to interact with the federal government a fair bit, presumably.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it goes a lot to the fact that we are so small and we have limited capacity. We're expected to deliver all of the same types of programs that a province would. And, we only have 40,000 people. And that's why as the Premier, I'm also the Minister of Justice, and our Minister of Education is also the Minister of Culture and Employment and Industry and Tourism and Investment, because we all have to pick up a lot of the slack. And so we just don't have the capacity to do a lot of those things. And so we do work with the federal government, especially in terms of funding.
But that has got to be enormously frustrating for you. Okay, you are governing a land area so vast that it borders on BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba to the south. And there's one federal member of parliament for that entire region. So how much could the federal government even possibly know about the NWT? What share of mind are you getting in Ottawa, in a place that has a lot of control over your destiny?
Well, that is one of the biggest challenges, is just getting the ear of Ottawa. Minister Vandal, Minister of Northern Affairs, I could call him up right now. He's very open to having those conversations, and I know that he does his best to educate his cabinet colleagues. But it is difficult when you have the one seat to get someone's ear. And I understand that you have a large population to serve. We're only 40,000 people. But a big part of our job is the education piece, doing what I'm doing now and letting people know how vast we are, what our challenges are, and things like that. Because unless you really understand that, you don't. When you see those challenges, you can see why only 40,000 people need this much money, which is significantly more than 40,000 people in somewhere else in Canada might need to do something. And so that's a hard sell.
Right. I mean, I think I'm going to raise something now that I think has got to be very important to you. And I'm just going to ask you kind of open-ended and let you just opine for a little bit about this. The country is consumed, the southern part of the country right now is consumed with a fight about climate policy. And it's run smack in, climate action has run smack into affordability. The carbon tax has become the pointy edge of the stick on this. And there seems to be, any way you look at it in southern Canada, certainly outside of Quebec, a move backwards in terms of the determination to deal with climate change. less steam in that particular engine and more focus on what do we do to make life affordable, particularly canceling the carbon tax. So I'll just preempt you a little bit and say that I know that you have your own carbon pricing system in the Northwest Territories, and there, which I don't know anything about, but I do know that you're not subject to the federal backstop carbon tax. So maybe this whole debate's irrelevant. But how is this debate going on up in the NWT? Climate versus cost.
Yeah, well, the debate is not irrelevant because we have our own carbon pricing system because there's a federal requirement to have a carbon pricing system. And so I don't expect we would have put one in place if there was not that law. And, I'm not, we see the effects of climate change firsthand. And I think everyone knows that, the North, the poles are warming more quickly than the rest of the world. And so we just experienced a fire season that, we had firefighters who came out of retirement, 40-year plus careers, who have never seen anything like what we saw this year.
Can I just stop you? Because it's important.
Yeah.
You attribute those fires to climate change, not to arson and not to any other picadillo. You associate it with climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I live sort of in an area surrounded by trees, by bush, and I see the land and, are the trees, the poplars and aspen, the leaves were limp on them this year. When the snow melted, there's usually puddles all over for weeks on end. It absorbed into the ground so quickly because it is just so dry. The drought conditions in the north are unlike anything we've ever seen before. The water levels on the Great Slave Lake and the Mackenzie River and the Hay River, where the river on which I live, are lower than we've ever seen before. Nothing that's happened in the past few years has any sort of precedent. Everything is off the charts. Everything is off the charts. And I think that it's, you can draw a pretty clear line between that and climate change. So right. Yeah, I have no doubt that we can attribute these extreme events to climate change. That being said, I know the idea of a carbon price, a tax on anything, is to change behavior. You make smokes more expensive if you don't want people to smoke. The issue we have up here is things are so expensive already. If there was a reason, if that was going to cause us to make the changes, we would have done that. But the issue is when you're in the Northwest Territories, it's in the winter, there's not a lot of sunlight.
Why don't people take more transit?
This is the issue. And this is why we need to educate people, right? A lot of the solutions that work everywhere else in Canada don't work in the North. It's too cold to use certain things like heat pumps. So we have a lot of these issues, even electric vehicles. I mean, I am pretty nervous about
range.
And having the state charging stations, all those types of things. We have a lot of communities still powered by diesel. And so we do want to get off diesel. We want to make all of these changes. We don't have the capacity to do it right now. And the carbon tax does help us with the financing for that, but it makes life very difficult for a lot of people, and especially the further north you go and in the more remote communities where I think, you and your listeners and even myself would be shocked to see the prices people pay for everyday items. It's really unbelievable. And in a lot of communities, that's where there's still a reliance on...
What's a for instance? Give us a for instance. What's a for instance?
Well, we have one MLA who would send us pictures when he's out in the community, send us a picture from the local store of a Christmas toy you might want to get for your kid. So a Nerf gun that's $20 here is $100 there. So that's just a simple thing, 5 times as much. And the same goes for any types of fruit or milk. You could be paying $16, $18 for a gallon of milk. There's no way you could go to a store and feed a family on an average wage.
Right. So how do people make do?
It's tough. Where I'm from, and I am only an hour north of the Alberta border. I think the cost of food here, it's generally about 30% more than it would be an hour south of the Alberta border. And so as soon as you cross that border, because of the cost of things like power, we're not connected to the southern grid, the price just goes up. And so in the small communities, there's a lot of reliance on hunting still and fishing, a lot of traditional lifestyles for the Indigenous residents of those communities. We have pretty generous income assistance programs here. And I say generous in that you can get by. It's not, no one's going to get rich off it, but we have subsidized housing. and income assistance that will help pay your utilities and your heat. And so we try to do what we can to keep a roof over people's heads. But there is still a lot of challenges and a lot of poverty in the territory, despite the fact we have a lot of good jobs and a lot of people making very good wages.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, one of the key things you said off the beginning is that 50% of the population is First Nations. Maybe another 10% are Métis. You got that right?
So 50% Indigenous. So Inuit, Métis, and First Nation.
All right. Okay. So how's the reconciliation agenda going?
It's all relative. And so you ask some people up here and maybe they don't think we're far enough ahead. But I think relative to the rest of Canada, we are light years ahead. When you're reconciling with yourself, essentially, you can move much more quickly. And most of our MLAs are Indigenous. Same with the cabinet, and it's been that way for years. And so, we are building on the work that the previous governments have done and the previous Indigenous governments have done. So we have just, in the last government, passed our United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Implementation Act. We are going to begin co-developing with the Indigenous governments the action plan to achieve those goals. We have the NWT Council of Leaders, which is a table where myself and my ministers sit along with all of the Indigenous leaders from around the territory. We have a co-management regime for lands and resources with the Indigenous governments. So, you're not gonna open a mine up here without free, prior, and informed consent, and that's without UNDRIP. So we are, I think, light years ahead in terms of reconciliation, but there's definitely more work to be done. I really want to make advances on our land claims and our implementation of these agreements over the next 4 years, and I think we can do that as well. So I think there's a lot of good things going on, and we can be a model for the rest of Canada and other places in the world.
Are most of the Indigenous people living on reserve?
No, we have 2 reserves. The population is maybe in total a few hundred people. Probably, I would say, much less than 1,000 people living on our 2 small reserves.
Right.
They just never got into that up here. I mean, the federal government didn't really take that approach up here. So that's part of the reason I think we have the land claims covering the entire territory. And I'll say that going back to the federal discussion, a lot of the programs that the federal government initiates, when they talk about Indigenous people, it's on reserve. And so one of the things I always advocate for is that when the feds are creating any sort of program, think about the North and how the program will need to be amended to work in the North. So, a program might work great for the provinces, but it might need some tweaks for the North. And so I just want them to put their minds to that.
Interesting. So, last week, while the late Brian Mulroney lay in state across from Parliament Hill, a new poll came out that would have brought a grin to his famous lantern jaw. Turns out 87% of Liberals now regard his record as positive. Among Bloc Québécois supporters, the number was 90%. Among Conservatives, 85%. To put it mildly, his policies didn't thrill most Canadians back in the day. The country was split on free trade, and the GST, well, you can imagine. A lot of people were also uncomfortable with his drive for privatization. Before Mulroney, governments dominated a slew of industries. They owned Air Canada, several electricity utilities, Petro-Canada, a uranium concern, and a potash company, to name a few. And yes, our sponsor, CN, the biggest railway in Canada. Mulroney believed they would be more efficient and less politicized as private companies. So he aggressively began a sell-off. The left hated privatization, and even the Liberal center wasn't keen on it. Privatization shook up the order of things. But in most cases, the performance of the privatized companies soared. CN has gone from trailing the industry in efficiency to leading. It is a reliable and excellent performer in millions of RRSPs. CN was widely mocked as a money sinkhole by experts when it was first sold. But anyone who bought a substantial amount of CN stock 30 years ago has done very well indeed. Okay, look. I know CN was actually sold under Paul Martin, my old boss, a couple of years after Brian Mulroney retired. I was there. But I also know Brian Mulroney laid the groundwork. May the road rise to greet him. To use one of his favorite phrases, Mr. Mulroney was a great Canadian. So give some free advice to politicians and business people in the South. How do you get resource extraction projects done?
Well, you start engaging with the Indigenous people early, very early. And so right now we're looking at a lot of exploration for lithium. And, I've heard from the communities that, they're very well versed in diamonds and gold because of our history up here. They don't necessarily know about lithium. And, a lot of people have been burnt by mining and, you look at Giant Mine and that catastrophe and that impact on the environment and Indigenous people here. There's a legacy of significant pollution and arsenic associated with that. And you look at uranium mining and the issues associated with that. And so people are not opposed to development, but they need to know what's going on. They need to know that their land is going to be taken care of. And we now have in place regimes that the environment is going to be taken care of in the Northwest Territories. No two ways about it. We have those systems in place, but it's a matter of working with the Indigenous governments, ensuring that they're seeing the benefits from the extraction of resources on their land. And there's a desire from the Indigenous governments to see development. They've seen the benefits of mining and resource extraction, and they want their future generations to see that as well. But it has to be done sustainably.
What do you think the components of it are? I mean, you've talked broadly about involvement, obviously, in the financial aspect of it, and you've talked about concerns about health and environmental damage from mining. So what does an Indigenous community want to hear from a developer in order to agree?
Well, I think they want, and I can't speak on behalf of them, and every community is different, right? It's a large territory and people have different expectations, but just, what are you going to be doing on our land? We want to make sure you're taking care of our land. What's the benefit of this? Are you going to ensure that our people are employed? And these are all very valid concerns. This is the land that sustained people for thousands of years and still is, and there could be impacts on caribou. There could be impacts on water. They want to make sure that is taken into consideration. So I think information sharing, in politics, I've come to learn that probably 80% of problems come from a lack of communication. We can solve almost everything if we just communicate more. And so that would be my recommendation. Just communicate. And honest communication, honest engagement, not just sending a letter or something, because a lot of these Indigenous governments are very small. And I know I send them letters. All of my ministers send them letters on a regular basis. You really need to get into the communities and have conversations.
Right. So do you have the same elected leadership versus hereditary leadership issues that some parts of the country do?
I have not run into those issues up here.
So they're all elected.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's not to say there's not traditions in some of the communities with the hereditary leaders, but it hasn't come up as an issue that we've encountered.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned housing in your list of things. I can't believe you've got the same housing price pressures that have occurred in, say, Toronto over the last decade up there. So what's the housing issue?
Well, I think the Yellowknife is probably up there with Vancouver and Toronto in terms of the costs.
Really?
So, oh yeah, absolutely. It's pretty pricey, and maybe not today, but I mean, in the past few years, they've been mentioned in the same breath. Part of the issue.
Can I spend $1 million on a place in Yellowknife?
Oh yeah, you could spend $500,000 on a duplex, half a duplex.
Get out!
I'm sure you can spend $1 million on a full house easily. Yeah.
Why?
It's expensive to build. It's in the Shield. It's 2,000 kilometers from Edmonton, where you're going to get a lot of your supplies from. It's cold. There's a high demand for labor, and so wages are higher. All of these things come into play here. There's difficulties accessing land sometimes because we haven't settled our land claims yet, and we want to make sure that that's all done in a way that respects the Indigenous governments and we're not giving away land before we settle those.
Right.
And so there's those issues. We also, a lot of the territory was built up 50, 60 years ago. and then things come of age. And so, after 30, 40, 50 years, all of a sudden, a lot of the housing stock needs to be replaced. And so it's not like we have an extensive stock. So that's part of the issue there as well. And in the small communities, if you have to barge in all of your material, that's expensive. Then you need to barge in or fly in tradespeople to build homes. That's expensive. And there's short building seasons. So you might barge your stuff up one summer and then go to build the next summer, and maybe some of your lumber's disappeared. And so then you got to deal with that. So there's a litany of issues that we're dealing with up here.
You're sort of blowing my mind. I mean, I have seen the food prices over the years, and I look at it and I go, how does anybody pay that? Like, how could you even buy that product? Now you're telling me about housing. How do ordinary people live up there? What does an electrician make?
Well, it all depends on where you're working, what you're doing, but you can make a very good living up here, especially if you're going out into the communities. You get your duty travel pay to go out there, but you can make, I think for the longest time, Yellowknife and Fort McMurray were the top two communities in terms of household income in Canada for the last 25 years. So you can definitely make good money up here. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
Yeah. And I'll say too that we have a lot of people who don't have adequate housing because of that. And so in a lot of the small communities where there is very limited or no economy, people they don't have the ability to build their own homes. And so they're living in inadequate homes. They're living in subsidized housing. So it's not just the affordability part of it. There's the lack of adequate housing. And in some of the other communities, the regional centers, it's hard to bring, you might need to bring an electrician. You might need to hire an electrician because there's none in town. So you hire someone, they come up here, there's nowhere to rent, there's nowhere to buy. And so you can't even, build your business to help grow the economy. So housing really is impacting all aspects of life, from health to education, to the economy.
Right. Do you have a homelessness issue?
Yes, we do. Yeah, absolutely. The North is so large that, and so sparsely populated that we can't offer all of the services in all of the communities. And so we have a very elaborate medical travel system here. People are always flying around the territory and out of the territory for medical service. And, we run into situations where often people will fly into Yellowknife, into the capital. We have a large hospital there to get services. And, if we have a lot of addictions issues in the territory, and someone might, go meet some of their friends out on the street and start drinking and miss their plane home. And now they're on the street in Yellowknife. And so there's, quite a few homeless in Yellowknife. Here in my community, we had the high rise, we call it, because it's the only high rise. I'm
from Regina. It's nothing to be ashamed of.
and that building shut down a few years ago, like rather abruptly. And that was 120 units in there that we lost. And a lot of those units were housing vulnerable individuals, low-income individuals. And so now even here in this community of 3,500, we have a homelessness issue. And we're seeing it, a lot of couch surfing in the smaller communities. So it is, it's across the board.
Right. So how did, keeping on this affordability thing, how has inflation affected the NWT? Have you seen the same rise in prices from the already high level you were at? And so is affordability dominating the political discourse in the NWT the way it is elsewhere? We've experienced inflation just like everyone else. And so, we are seeing those big increases. And I'll say from the government perspective, it's really hit us in terms of our ability to build things like social housing, because we've seen those massive increases in those areas. Even in terms of our road infrastructure, we want to build, and the feds have supported us to build new highways. But when the feds commit X really?
amount
I thought they were out of that business.
No. When I first heard that, I thought this must be out of context, because I know they're not out of that business. And sure enough, I got a call saying, we're not out of that business. We're still supporting you. So,
okay, good. All right.
Yeah, for sure. But, if the feds commit us X dollars back in 2019 for this project, well, it's now 2024, some things have doubled in price. So when we're going to build 50 kilometers of the highway, now we're doing 25. And so, that's really impacting us as well. And just everyday items have gone up, so it's made it tough for people. But I wouldn't say it's dominating the conversation right now, because healthcare is one of our major issues right now. Housing, one of our major issues. So it is one of the issues we're dealing with, but perhaps not dominating the way it is in Southern Canada. That being said, I'm not in Southern Canada, so I can't really say what the conversation is there.
The healthcare issues must be very different. I presume there's some things. I presume it's difficult to get a family doctor in the NWT, and it's difficult to get a family doctor in most of Canada. But the healthcare infrastructure must be very, very different. How many hospitals are there?
Well, we have one large hospital in Yellowknife, and then we have, here in my community, the second largest community, Hay River. We have a health center. It's basically built as a hospital, but it's a health center, and we have those in the regional centers. So we have a few larger communities, and then in the smaller communities, we might have a health cabin, they're called. We might have one nurse there. Some communities have no nurses, so it's a much different landscape. And my mom's family from Manitoba, there's a lot of small communities out there, very small communities without a nurse or without a doctor, but they can get in their car and drive, even if it's an hour or two, to a community where they can get those services. Whereas That's not the situation here. You got to jump on a plane to get to see a doctor a lot of times. And I haven't had a family doctor's, in 30 years.
Okay, so when the kid has the sniffles, what do people do?
Well, we do have, so in my community, we do have a hospital here. We do have a healthcare center. So you can take them in, and you can see a doctor sometimes. Sometimes we have one in the community, maybe two, maybe three if we're lucky. But really what you see is nurses a lot of times running around, working themselves half to death because those demands are still there, right? A kid's going to get the sniffles, whether or not there are staff. And so it is tough on our nursing staff. They're getting burnt out. Sometimes if you have one doctor, you'll literally see them running from inpatient to the emergency room and back and forth. So I think what we really miss is a lot of that preventative care, because I can't call up and get an appointment to go see a doctor. It's not easy. And so I'm not going to go get a checkup. I'm not going to get screened for certain things. And I think we really see the impacts of that.
Right. I presume it's difficult to get people to practice medicine, to move there to practice medicine. So would you agree with me that your best chance of getting doctors to practice there is to have people from there trained as doctors?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. The other issue is that, back when the federal government was running the operations here, they have deeper pockets and they were able to pay their healthcare professionals more than anywhere else in Canada. And that would more than make up for the isolation and the higher cost of living. Since the government of the Northwest Territories has taken that over, we don't have those deep pockets. And so the gap between what we pay and what they pay in other jurisdictions has shrunk. And with the challenges we're seeing across Canada, other jurisdictions with more money are now
outbidding you.
Exactly. And so it is getting tough to make those changes. But yes, absolutely. Education, having people locally provide those services is important. But then we always have to remember, not everyone wants to go back to their home community and work in their home community. And so we see a lot of that as well. Get educated and they'll leave. In some communities, some people are not necessarily fans of education because if their children get educated, they think they're going to leave.
Right. So what's the solution for you to healthcare access?
I mean, that's the big question, right? So the health department has really looked at how they can retain and attract staff. And that's, a lot can be done outside of, higher pay. And that's not to say we don't pay well up here. The salaries might, the difference with salaries might be shrinking with Southern Canada, but there's a lot of other benefits, right? A lot of overtime and things like that. So if you want to make some money, you can definitely come up here. But just making it a more pleasant work environment, offering those other types of perks that you might not get in a Southern jurisdiction. And there's also a type of person who likes living up north. It's a beautiful place to live. I mean, the access to the outdoors is you can't beat it, right? You walk out your front door, you're almost in the wilderness, right? So There's a lot of people who like that. So I think really pushing that aspect of it too, and attracting the people who want to be here, because a common story in the north is that someone will say, "Yeah, I came up for work for 2 or 3 years, and that was 30 years ago. And so we hear that a lot. So it's just getting them here, and the ones who love it, they'll stick around.
Right. Okay. So do you have an agenda for the federal government you'd like to lay out here?
So we are, like I said, with a consensus government system, we have to develop our mandate after we're elected. And so we are right in that process right now. So once we get that mandate laid out, we're going to have a federal engagement strategy, and we're going to go forward and work with the federal government. But in the meantime, when I talk to the Prime Minister, when I talk to the federal ministers, I let them know, I sort of have the same conversation we're having about the challenges we're facing, trying to really drive home that difference between life in the territory, operating a government in the territory, and in Southern Canada. So yeah, my message is always consider the North when you're creating any program, any policy. Consider that it needs to be different, because if you try to paint us all with the same brush, it just won't work up here. And we've seen it over and over and over again. And to the Fed's credit, they do have the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. It's just a matter now of ensuring that the decisions they make are in line with that, and that we're advancing that.
Here's a dumb Southerner's question. What are the lifestyle expectations of somebody that lives in the NWT relative to somebody that lives in the South? Are they expecting everything to be the same? Are they expecting some things to be of equal quality, but know that other things will be different? What is the aspiration for standard of living there? Is it to be the same as it is in Edmonton, or are people up there for some different reason and know that things will always be different than Edmonton?
Well, I think you have to have an understanding that if you are, in a community that's not connected to a highway system, that you're not going to get the services you get in Edmonton. That being said, Yellowknife is a modern city. Where I'm living here, we have stores, we have, a beautiful golf course, ski club, arena, nice swimming pool. So there are the communities that have all of those sort of southern comforts and are connected to the highway system. What you might miss out on is, we're not going to get you're not going to be able to go to an NHL game on a whim. We're not going to have concerts come through here. It's a little more difficult to get places. It takes longer to get places. I just went down to Montreal for Prime Minister Mulroney's service, and I had to leave on the Thursday evening from my home. Fly was 16 hours on Saturday, and then the same thing getting back. So it's a 3-day trip to right. Get anywhere and get back. So there's those types of differences, but for the most part, we're still in Canada. There's still stores. You're going to get your familiar products. It just might be it's going to be a lot.
What about schools?
We have, and that sort of reminds me of some of the other challenges we face. With 40,000 people, we have 49 schools. And so even just the idea of operating 49 schools and building 49 schools, it gives you a sense of how expensive things are up here. But, we do pay our teachers quite well here relative to the rest of Canada. And that's one area where Canada hasn't caught up with our wages. And so we don't have that same shortage of teachers you might see elsewhere. A lot of the teachers we get, maybe they're fresh out of college, and so they might not have that experience, but it's an opportunity for them to come and experience different culture and learn and really become integrated into that community. And so there's a lot of opportunity for that. That being said, we do need to do a better job of improving our education rates, ensuring that students who are graduating have the skills to go to university. And we've made a lot of changes in the past few years to try and achieve that.
What would have been missing there? I was going to ask you about that. Does a kid graduating from high school in Yellowknife have as good a chance of getting into the U of A as anybody else does? Or is their education considered to be somehow lesser?
Oh, no, absolutely not. Like in Yellowknife, especially Yellowknife, Hay River, some of the large, Fort Smith, the larger communities, you're going to get the same education you're getting elsewhere. Really, when it comes down to education, the biggest difference is the quality of the teacher. And in a lot of our communities, we have teachers who have a lot of experience. Right. And so there's the facilities, there's the experienced teachers, they're going to do okay. It's really the smaller communities where they don't have that consistency with teachers, and they don't necessarily have the facilities. They might not have a gym in their class. They won't have a shop in their class. And so they don't necessarily get all of those experiences. But again, that's similar for a lot of parts of rural Canada.
Right. Hey, just out of the blue, off the wall thing. I mean, now that the Arctic's melting, there's a lot of talk that that's going to be a geopolitical conflict zone, and that you're going to see Chinese ships and Russian ships and NATO ships all scrambling around there trying to control that area. Does that have any impact on you?
Well, because we are a small jurisdiction, we don't necessarily get into that international sphere as much as we might if, say, we were Alaska. I think they probably have more involvement in that. With that being said, you're right. I mean, the Northwest Passage comes through the Northwest Territories. Some people might think it's international waters, but it's within our territory, and so there are concerns about that. The Inuvialuit, who are on the North Shore of Canada, they are very vested in that area, and I know they have a strong relationship with the federal government, and so they're very involved with that. I had a call with Minister Jolie just last week talking about this, and so from our perspective, we understand that it is the government of Canada who is in charge of national security. That being said, we also know because of the DEW line and things like that we are on the front lines of if Russia was feeling aggressive towards us, we'd be on the front line. So yes, there is that awareness.
Do you welcome more military activity up there? Do you welcome Canadian subs, for instance, nuclear subs up there?
Well, I mean, that's the thing about the territory is that's not a question for me to answer.
But the citizens are going to have an opinion, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Up here, we need to work with Indigenous governments on that, and especially the Inuvialuit, because that is their region, that's their homeland, and they live on those shores. But I'm in favor of having a military presence in the Northwest Territories and an enhanced military presence in the Northwest Territories. Definitely.
Okay. You really, really intrigued me with the land claims component of your message and how many there are and how positive you are about them and how much you see them as part of the NWT's future. So what is the optimistic future for the territory? How does it look 10, 15 years from now?
Well, we have a number of land claims that are, we have a number that are settled, and they're now working on implementation. How do they start drawing down authority? How do they start delivering programs? So we need to continue working with them. But there's a lot of areas or a lot of claims that aren't settled. And some of them have been going on 20 and 30 years. And I do not, there's a lot of things. I mean, for 20 and 30 years, there's a lot of different things. A lot of it comes down to land. Part of it is a change in leadership. You might have a community whose leader changes and then they want to reset the relationship, and that puts them back a few years. You talk to some of the Indigenous governments and they'll say the government of the Northwest Territories is the problem. For our side, we're a public government. And so we do have to represent the interests of the public. That being said, we have a public here, we have people here because there's Indigenous people here, and the federal government, set up systems to serve those Indigenous people. So I think there's traditional positions that the government of the Northwest Territory can move on, and those are changed from government from table to table. But in some cases, it might be the amount of land that the Indigenous government is looking for in the territory. It might be the control of resources. We want to ensure that the territory is a good place to do business. We want to invite industry, and so we want to ensure that there is a lands and resource management system across the territory that is understandable and accessible. And so it's getting to the point where we come to agreement on that. So sometimes it could be money, but I haven't seen anything yet that I think is insurmountable. So I'm very excited that we are going to make significant progress. And I'll say that once you settle a land claim, once you get a self-government agreement in place, that brings in a lot of money into the communities, into the regions, and into a lot of those regions where there isn't an economy. And so there's a lot of opportunity there a lot of economic opportunity in addition to the self-determination and the social side of things.
Right. Okay. So I guess my last question to you is, if anybody wanted to come up and visit, where should they go?
Well, I mean, I'm the MLA for Hay River, so you can come by Hay River. It's a great place to settle down. But there's a lot to do here in the Northwest Territories. Like 1.3 million square kilometers. You can go live up in the high Arctic, in the tundra.
Right.
You can live on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. In Yellowknife, if you want a bit of a bigger city, you can go there. But there's I would recommend that if you want to come up to the Northwest Territories, you come up here, you drive up here, and you get to see the sites on the highway system, and visit the local communities. The thing about the North, small towns, very welcoming, right? So I think that a lot of the tourists I talk to, they always enjoy their trips up here. And if you want to come to work, take your pick. There's a lot of work up here, a lot of opportunity, and a lot of business who would be anxious to get you.
So I don't think I've been able to get you in any trouble yet, but I'm going to try one more time, right? Why would a person who wanted to go north go to the NWT instead of Yukon? They're different. I guess it depends on why you want to come north. If you have a job lined up, you're going where that job is. Right. But the Northwest Territories. I just wanted you to brag about the NWT. That's all. Tell me why it's better than Yukon.
Well, you know what? I actually haven't been to the Yukon yet. I got a meeting coming up there soon. I talk to Premier Ranj all the time.
Yeah.
I'm not going to knock the Yukon, but I think North is a big enough place for everyone. We're welcoming. And I'll say the one thing: if you want to see the Northern Lights, come up north. We got the best Northern Lights in the world up here.
Well, that is something, because that's a spectacular sight to see. And I believe I saw them the night I was in Rayenzo. It was pretty special.
There's times when you can look every direction all around you, and the entire sky is green, horizon to horizon. So that alone is worth the trip.
Yeah. Premier, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. This has been great. Anytime.
Yeah, it's been super interesting. I've learned an awful lot. So thank you for that. I need to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I want to thank all you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to this pod and learned a lot about a subject you probably didn't know enough about, and now know a little bit more about Canada's North. And thank you to the Premier for being here with us. And we'll talk to you again, I'm sure, as time marches on. Thanks very much for your time, and good luck to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.